Good afternoon and welcome to today's Best Production Practices webinar. This is part of our Learn at Lunch series, and it is made possible due to a grant from the Farm Service Agency. Another component of this grant is the eFarm Management website, and I will paste this link into the chat box in the lower right corner. Please enter any questions into the chat box as well, and the presenters will answer them at the end of the webinar. Today's speakers are Dr. Lynn Brandenberger and Dr. Josh Lofton, and I'm going to turn it over to Lynn now, and he will begin the presentation.
Okay, hopefully everybody can hear me, and we'll move forward on this. Brent asked me a few weeks ago to talk about cover crops and also weed control for vegetable crops. So that's what we'll be discussing this morning, or this afternoon. So if we can have the next slide, Brent. One of the things that we need to think about is why would we want to use a cover crop? Well, in the vegetable world, we use a lot of clean tillage, and that's kind of what we've done for a long time. Part of it has to do with the types of crops that we grow. When we start talking about something like spinach that might be machine harvested, we need to have very clean fields. We cannot have crop debris in the field because the machine will pick it up, that sort of thing. Part of it's just tradition. That's kind of what we've done. If you're tilling soil all the time, you're basically fluffing them up, putting a lot of oxygen into them, and so the microbiological organisms that are in the soil that break down organic matter, it's kind of like hitting the turbo on your car. They work even harder and faster when they get all that oxygen. Long story short, most tilled soils in the southern plains that are under conventional tillage systems, 0.5 to 0.7 of an percent organic matter in those soils, which is very, very low. Low organic matter in soil causes all sorts of problems. If we're in a heavier soil, we'll have poor drainage. We may have poor aeration, because what we're trying to do is fill up those pore spaces with some organic matter. It creates airspace, creates places for water to be held in, say, sandy soils. And it also holds nutrients if we've got organic matter in the soil. So, long story short, when we have soils that are very low in organic matter, we lose out on production of different crops. Next slide, please. So cover crops are one way to alleviate or fix this problem. I kind of like to call it grown in place organic matter, or grow in place organic matter. The great thing about cover crops is you don't have to go get the organic matter to add to the soil. You don't have to truck it around. You don't have to spread it. You don't have any food safety concerns because we're not talking about manure here. We're talking about plant material. No composting to do, because basically the soil will compost this organic matter on its own without your help. Bottom line, it's easier, less is involved in it, but it means that you'll have fields that are in cover crops, and you cannot grow a cash crop while you're trying to grow a cover crop. So you're going to lose out on that income from the field at that point. So there are pros and cons to any system, and that's kind of the con, or the bad part of cover crops, is it actually takes a field out of production while the cover crop's in the field. Next slide. We've done work for several years on a lot of different cover crops. I think we had about 4 or 5 years of looking at winter and summer cover crops separately. Our winter cover crops that we had in that study included winter wheat, which would be our grass, our annual grass in that system. And then we had crimson clover, Austrian winter pea as our legumes. And then we also did a pea and clover mix in that system. one of the reasons we like to have grasses as part of our cover crop regime is that grasses are fantastic at adding organic matter. They're champions at it. And an annual grass like wheat or cereal rye, hay grazer in the summertime is a great way to add organic matter. But then we like to have legumes also in the rotation, because legumes are able to fix nitrogen, so it's kind of like free fertilizer. If you wonder whether that really works or not, if you look at that bottom row of pictures, it'd be the second set of pictures from the left side. We've got the bottom picture says pea clover mix, and then the top picture says winter wheat. Now, those are pumpkins that were planted in our plots the same day, same variety, and one plot was just winter wheat. And you can see how much growth that winter wheat plot has, and then you look below that at the pea clover mix, and you can see that, guess what, that nitrogen that those legumes fixed is evident. It's very obvious that we've got a major amount of nitrogen in that soil that's available for that crop, because it's growing much faster, much more quickly, and in the end it yielded better. Summer cover crops that we've tried hay grazer. This year we're trying a new grass for the summer. We tried pearl millet. Didn't see a whole lot of difference at this point. Don't really have data to share, but anyway, either grass works pretty well. We also tried sesbania, cowpea, and lab as our summer legume crops. And to make a long story short on those legumes, and there are lots of other more exotic summer legumes that could be used, what we found was that just a good old common forage cowpea like iron clay or red ripper, something like that, is probably the best, because one, it's available locally, it's cheap, and cowpea, you'd think it would, lab would perform just like cowpea, but cowpea makes lab and sesbania look like wimps. It's very drought tolerant, very heat tolerant. These other plants will be laying on the ground. They're all shriveled up and looking like they're just about to die, and the cowpea's sitting there going, what is wrong with you people? I feel great. It even makes hay grazer look a little wimpy at times. So it's very tough, and it's a great legume for the summer. Next slide, please. So Brent asked me to visit a little bit about managing weeds in vegetable crops. And if you've never thought about how important weed control is, it really is one of the most limiting factors, particularly in vegetable crops. If you can have reasonable control over the weed species that are in your field, you can be successful in vegetable crops. If you're not able to control the weeds, a lot of times what you do is you just plow the crop up and try again later. So it can get pretty dicey in a hurry. Some of the things that ought to be considered when we're trying to manage weeds for vegetable crops is the crop and weed history. In other words, which crops have I grown, which did I have the most problems with on weeds, what weed species did I have a problem with, and in what time of the year, all that sort of thing is important. The different crop rotations that you might consider in order to rotate out of a weed problem. In other words, can I grow a cover crop or an agronomic crop that will shade the weeds that I'm having trouble with and reduce the amount of weed seed that the soil would have available to grow weeds the next crop around. Cover crops, and that's their big thing in the summer, is they're able to shade that soil and prevent a lot of other weedy species from growing and producing seed. Selecting crops. And you say, well, what's that got to do with weed management? Well, I'm going to give you two examples, extreme examples. The world's worst vegetable crop that we work with as far as weed competition is onion. Onion grows vertical. It's in the field for a long time. The leaves do not shade the soil surface, so it doesn't shade out weedy species. So that's a big problem for us. And so you just basically have a battle the whole time you're trying to grow a crop of onions. So if you put a crop of onions in a field that had a lot of weed issues, boy, you would have some serious problems. The other side of the coin would be something like pumpkin or, let's say, sweet potato. If you can control weeds for 30 days, after that the crop will shade out the ground and you'll have very few weeds to deal with. So the crop that you actually select to grow has a lot to do with whether you're going to have a lot of weed problems. Irrigation, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit more in a minute, but different methods of irrigation will affect the amount of weed problems you'll have. Mulching can help a lot. Cultivation, of course. There are beneficial organisms that will help the crop to produce and to grow faster and be able to get out ahead of the weed species that are in the field. And then last but not least, herbicides. So those are kind of some of the management tools we have for vegetable crops. So really it's like any other pest management system. The first thing you have to do is you have to know what you're dealing with. What species is it? At least we'd like to know that we've got henbit, or we've got eclipta, or we've got some wild mustard. What time of the year those particular weeds will be a problem, so we'll know which crops that we might have problems with these weeds. And I might add that if we're trying to manage weeds using different types of herbicides, then it's critical that we know which species of weeds we're dealing with, because some herbicides control some weeds, some herbicides control others. So it's important to know what you're dealing with. So crop rotations and cover crops can help with this. So you want to think about your production system. In other words, am I wanting to no-till cucurbit crops in the summertime? That's a possibility. Or am I talking about clean tillage system? So that's going to affect the amount of problems or issues that we might have with weeds. The right crop mix. If you're an onion grower and you've always had a whole lot of weed problems in a particular field, maybe it's time to think about growing it on another field or renting land with fewer of the weed species that you have problems with. That might be a possibility. Or maybe it's time to think about growing some type of agronomic crop which will allow you to clean up a lot of these weedy species, either because the crop's at a different time and you can clean them out, or because you've got herbicides that you can use to control those weeds with. So it all depends. You want to match that field and the rotation. In other words, am I going to rotate out of this crop to the next crop, or am I going to rotate to this cover crop that's going to help me solve some of my weed problems? And then, of course, keeping track of what herbicides have been applied, because we can have some carryover issues with herbicides, particularly in vegetable crops. So kind of weighing all these advantages, disadvantages when we're trying to put together a weed control program. Next. So we've kind of already alluded to this a little bit as far as crop selection. Different crops grow at different rates. They grow to different heights. Their ability to shade the ground is different. Some crops, say like legumes, it looks like we've got a bunch of cowpeas there in that upper picture. We can cultivate something like a bean or a pea throughout the season. Whereas if we're talking about something like a pumpkin, we get about a month in there where we can do some light cultivation, and after that the crop covers over and we can't cultivate any longer. So that's a difference. And then the ability of that crop species to compete and tolerate some weeds. I think one of the most interesting things I've ever done was we had a sweet potato trial one summer. We planted on July the 3rd, which is really late, but it was really, really hot. Sweet potatoes love heat. And so we transplanted into a field that already had freestanding raised beds with drip irrigation. I think I might have lost 4 or 5 slips out of hundreds, so that irrigation really helped. And we did use a pre-emergent herbicide for control of weeds, but that only takes you so far. But those sweet potatoes, took them a few days to recover, and then they started growing like crazy. Within a month, you couldn't even find bare soil out there. I think I spent, for an area that was probably a fifth of an acre, I probably spent 30 to 40 minutes the entire season hoeing, which is nothing. Trust me, that is nothing. So it's all got to do with trying to line a crop up in the time it wants to be grown. If you try to grow sweet potatoes in March, it's just not going to work, or even sometimes early May, it's not warm enough. And picking a crop that can compete well with the weed species that are in the field. Irrigation. There is not all irrigation systems are created equal when it comes to weed issues or managing weed species. If we're pumping water out of a water source, a surface water source, like in the upper right-hand picture there, we're going to pick up a lot of weed seeds. And those weed seeds may come from adjacent fields. They may come from a long ways away. And if we're overhead irrigating, we're sprinkler irrigating, we're basically seeding new weed species into our field. So that can be a problem. If we're flood or furrow irrigating, same deal applies. But if we're drip irrigating, even though we're using the same water, we're going to have to run it through a filter system. That filter system will filter out almost all the weed seeds, so we'll reduce the potential for new weed species in the field. So another aspect of this is with overhead irrigation and flood and furrow, basically we're irrigating the entire field surface, okay? So water's going everywhere, and that means that the weeds that are between the rows are watered just as well as the crop. Whereas with drip irrigation, a lot of times we will run one drip tape per row, and we're putting the water right down the row, so we're not watering all over the entire field, and weed species have less of a chance of going totally ballistic on us or crazy since we're not watering the entire field. Mulching is another option for weed control. So basically we're applying a cover over the soil, and if that cover reduces the amount of light that hits the soil surface, then we can control weeds with that cover. And that would be something like a black plastic or some other type of color plastic. Now, clear plastic, trust me, weeds will grow under clear plastic like crazy. They love it. But black plastic and other different types like infrared transmittable mulches, those sorts of things will reduce the amount of weed problems that we'll have in a field. They'll also help to warm the soil up more in the spring. One of the problems that you need to make sure you understand, though, is if you've got a weedy species, and we all know what the dreaded nut sedge or nut grass is, plastic mulch will not help with that at all. That nut sedge will grow right through plastic, no problem at all. Our organic types of mulches, like we show in the upper right-hand corner there, are good for weed control, but they're also great for reducing soil temperatures in the summertime. Now, you don't want to put an organic mulch down early in the spring when you're trying to get the soils warmed up so you can make your tomatoes grow faster, your vine crops grow faster. But once soil temperatures have come up to 75, 80 degrees, you can put a mulch on, some type of organic mulch, and it will reduce that soil temperature, which is a big benefit for crop performance. Also saves moisture, just like a plastic mulch will save moisture, and it reduces weed competition because you're shading the ground. You're back to that again. So cultivation is the use of mechanical weed control for crops. This is what we've traditionally done with a lot of vegetable crops. And, it can be a combination of cultivation and herbicides, or cultivation and some organic mulches that might follow it. It could be the sole method of weed control. It could be as nice as sitting on a nice big tractor with air-conditioned cab and cultivating multiple rows at one pass, or it could be as down and dirty as we're out of the tractor cab and we've got our hoe and we're hoeing a row. So that's kind of the way cultivation goes. Herbicides for weed control. We don't have near the herbicides for vegetable crops as we do for agronomic crops. Part of the reason is that ag chemical companies are not really encouraged by vegetable crops, meaning that their vegetable crops are often very sensitive to herbicides, so they might get damaged. We're talking high value, high risk crops. So if, let's say, a chemical company has to buy an acre of vegetables, you say, well, no problem, $200 or $300 and you're good. No, we're talking some vegetable crops you might have $2,000 or $3,000 of upfront costs in the crop before you ever get started. So you can see that you would, if a chemical company had to buy very many acres of that, they'd say, well, it's just not worth messing with. And that's kind of what they do. So what's being done about that? Well, fortunately, USDA figured this out a long time ago, that we've got problems with specialty crops, and so they developed the IR4 project, which works with the EPA to help register pesticides for minor use crops like vegetables. And so a lot of times what we're getting is a special local needs label, like that 24C there. And that website there will show you what 24C labels are available in Oklahoma on vegetable crops. And you can also check the county agent's handbook. Jim Schreffler and I work together on that most years, and try to keep that updated so you know what herbicides are available for vegetable crops, whether that's a pre-emergence or post-emergence herbicide. In conclusion, first off, if we're going to control weeds, we need to identify what weeds we're having a problem with. Is it a grass? Is it a broadleaf? Is it a cool season weed? Is it a warm season weed? On and on goes the list of questions to ask. And we also need to understand our production system. Are we doing clean tillage? Are we doing reduced tillage? Are we doing no-till? I mean, there's all these things about the production system that will affect weed control. And then our control strategy. We really need to look at it from a multiple attack point. We need to look at culturally, what can we do? Can we grow different crops? Can we go to different areas of the field? Biologically, are there organisms in the soil that will help our crops to grow faster? That might be as simple as inoculating legume seed with bacteria to help them fix nitrogen so they'll grow faster. That's an example. And then we also have chemical tools that are that we have available to us, particularly if we're conventional farming. Now, for organic farming, there are a few chemicals that are available to use, mostly as burn down materials. It could be some type of fatty acid, it could be pelargonic acid, maybe vinegar, those types of things that sometimes are used in organic systems. It could be In an organic system, we could use flame weeding for small weeds. That's a possibility. So there's a lot of different ways to approach this, and I think the main thing is to think about all those options rather than just saying, okay, this is the only way I can control weeds. With that, I'll try to answer any questions. Yeah, Damona has asked, is there a website you recommend for help with weed identification? And I believe that we used to, and I would think we still do have, a website here at Oklahoma State. It's within the Plant and Soil Science department. And on that website, it will help you identify weeds. The other thing that could be done would be taking pictures of weeds and then sending that to myself or Josh, or we actually have a weed scientist within our faculty in plant and soil science, Misha. I'm trying to think what Misha's last name. I always have a terrible time with it, but anyway, she's in plant and soil science. She could help you identify weeds. So there's a lot of us that work on this. Jim Schruffler's good at it. So that would be the way to approach weed ID, I would say. So Brent is trying to find this website. Okay, there's one for plant identification. Oh, it says weeds. Okay, so yeah, Amaranthus palmeri, Palmer amaranth, right on there, okay? So once you click on that weed, Brent, and see if you can bring up a picture of it.
I guess we can share.
Yeah, just. Just click on one, see what comes up. Copperleaf hophorn bean. Virginia copperleaf. So you see, you got a lot of pictures of it. They'll have. It probably depends on the species. Somebody might have a lot of pictures of a species and then just one or two of a different species. But there's several of this one. This shows it in flower and probably starting to set seed. So that would be a good website to have on your toolbar. Oh, Dr. Misha Manichu Harry. That's our weed scientist. And she's very knowledgeable about weed species. She's helped me just this past summer with some. Of course, I ask everybody as I go down the hall, do you know what this is? Just start asking questions when I'm not certain. More plants are being added monthly. Okay, great. So if there are no more questions, I think I'll stop and let Josh begin.
Thank you, Lance.
Thank you very much for listening.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes. You're coming through loud and clear.
That way we can wrap up fairly quickly. I'm going to go over agronomic management and kind of how we can help improve productivity. Very similar to Lynn. I talked to Brent, and we kind of went through a course of action of what we wanted to talk about. The unfortunate thing is you could probably do a whole university semester talking about these three subjects. So we're going to go very, gloss over these things somewhat quickly, kind of get everything going, kind of take a different approach to some of these. I see a lot of familiar names on the participants list, so probably know a good way to get a hold of me if you have any questions, or definitely would love to field any questions any of you might have. First, we're going to talk about crop rotation, why we rotate. Some very basic concepts, but there's no reason why these basic concepts can't be the sole driving force of why you select various crops into a crop production system. I'll say it again. probably sometime at some point today, but price is never or should never be within a crop rotation management scheme. That's a good way to kind of get yourself going into more a monocrop or a monoculture production system, is because usually there's a set amount of time to where price of one particular crop outweighs the other ones for multiple years at a time. Does that mean that we need to put all our acres in it? No, but it's a good reason to go heavily on one side or the other. But we should always stick to our rotations because the value is long term. Kind of talk about what we do and why it works, and kind of what potential alternatives we could have. Then we'll kind of go into some tillage explanation. We'll talk about advantages, and because we talk about conservation tillage, conventional tillage as kind of anti of each other, we'll talk about advantages of both, and it'll kind of spur the discussion of disadvantages of the other, kind of see how that affects management practices and our management decision, and then we'll kind of help bring it all together. These can be very distinct topics, but if we kind of help bring it all together, it kind of makes things feel a little bit better. In Oklahoma, we pretty much talk about small grains and cereals as our primary crop. That's our crop of choice. Our growers, they know how to grow it. They know how to make it profitable. I say sometimes because I think at 275 wheat, there's not a way to make it profitable at most times. But especially with the cattle market in pretty good demand, we can make some of our small grains and our cereals somewhat profitable. So we get asked the question all the time: is why would I change? I know how to grow wheat. I know how to make it work, and I know how to make it profitable. And it kind of goes back to something I said earlier, is that what we're doing is we're providing inputs now to get a little bit of payback later, and that's why we have that consistency of crop rotation within our system. When we look at benefits to the system, one of the biggest and largest benefits is crop rotation, is IPM. Lynn talked a little bit about managing your weeds within a system. It's a lot easier to manage your weeds when you're rotating crops, as if you're having one crop grown year in and year out. And then in small acreage production or vegetable production, it might not be as big of an issue, but in large scale agriculture, unfortunately, we become very set on a crop and kind of go with it. So when we do grow that crop over and over in a more consistent basis, what we have is our yield and profit margins get ultimately larger. Is that we need high input to just maintain yield. And that's where we're at in our wheat systems right now. We keep on putting more and more inputs, more nitrogen goes into it, more technologies going into it, more genetics are going into it, but our yields haven't increased. And there on the opposite side of the coin, if we go into a low input system, what we're going to typically do is see a yield decline. So there's no winning on that. You're putting more money into it to get the same yields you did 10 years ago. And to kind of emphasize this point, we look at historic wheat yields, is that from the 1800s to the 1950s, without any big technological advance, we maintained about a half ton per acre of wheat grain in the state of Oklahoma. When we brought in semi-dwarf varieties, we had improved fertilization through increased purity of our fertilization or fertilizers that we used. We did increase. We went up to about a ton per acre, so that's 100% fold increase, and that happened kind of right in those 1950s, 1980s, kind of that back end of the 1970s. However, since the 1980s, what we've seen in the Southern Great Plains, or the Great Plains in general, is we've seen only about a 6 pound per year increase in our wheat yield. And the benefit to Oklahoma does not look as bright, because ever since the 1980s, we've actually been decreasing our average yield by about a pound a year. So even though we've got better genetics, Dr. Carver here at Oklahoma State, as well as a lot of the private industry, getting better technological advances, we're still as a state decreasing our pounds per year. And so the question becomes is realistically, how do we improve this? How do we break out of this cycle? Well, the biggest thing is to just rotate. Adding crop diversity has been shown to drastically increase crop yields. So what we have is figures over here to the right-hand side. This is one of the first projects we did about integrating canola into our typical wheat systems. So the field they actually conducted this study on had been a 10-year continuous wheat system. When you added canola into the system, as far as our wheat yields that year after canola, what we saw is about a 10 to 20% increase in our wheat yields. Now, remember, since 1980s, everything we've done has been decreasing our wheat yields, but we add crop rotation in, and we're seeing a 10 to 20% increase in our wheat yields. If you're a cattle guy, you're working with a lot of cattle growers, the question becomes, well, that's fine. I don't care about wheat yields. I make my money on forage. Crop rotation does the same. We see that around 20 to 25% increase in our forage yields from our wheat production system in that dual purpose wheat when we actually do get into a crop rotation. And not only does this help as far as a increase in our just yields, that way our growers can go to the coffee shop, kind of brag a little bit about they have better yields, but increased net profits. We've actually seen that even if you have a canola crop that fails to where you bring no economic income into your farming system during a single calendar year, you actually, as a 5-year total of your system, have actually been able to increase net profits. And so just adding in those crop rotations have been able to drastically increase, farm budgets and farm stability, farm security. So the question becomes, is this just in Oklahoma or just in wheat? And if you look across the U.S., the most successful crop production systems are consistently rotated. In the Midwest, we talk about corn and soybean. I mean, it's never just a corn state, never just a soybean state. It's corn and soybean states, and we see those pretty consistently rotated on a year in, year out basis. On the Southeast, a lot of sugarcane, rice production down in that part of the world. You're looking at both of those being rotated with soybeans and usually are quite successful. Southern U.S., we're talking here in the Southern Great Plains, wheat and soybean are a very common one. Wheat cotton is becoming a bigger thing. And then when we talk about Northern Great Plains, we bring in things like lentils, peas, dry edible beans, and various other crops like that. And our cereals, they grow a lot more oats and rye up there as opposed to us that predominantly grow wheat. But the same general concept is we're seeing increase in yields and increased stability of that system. So the question becomes, does anybody see a trend here? I see a trend, and it's one thing that's pretty consistently about all your crop rotations is the yield benefits that we're getting are basic rotational concepts. It's getting that monocot, which are our grasses, and a dicot, which are our broadleaves, and integrating those into a system together. And what it does is it actually just brings diversity. I mean, we've talked about diversity in a pretty wide sense in the last 5 years with NRCS and cover crops and bringing cover crops into production system. We talk about diversity and management. And that's fine, but we can do that same exact thing by just rotating our crops around. Because allowing that to happen allows us to break our cycles. Lynn talked a lot about this and breaking our cycles, whether it be disease, insect, or weed cycles, allowing for rotation of management. Maybe you can do something like, corn or milo in a no-till production system where something you grow like canola needs to be in a more conventional tilled system. So you can rotate your management practices around. Also spreads your risk, especially if you're doing monocot, dicot. Most of the dicots we grow in the state are in an oil market, an oil seed market. So we're talking about soybean, canola, sesame, various things like that, where our milo and our corn as well as our wheat are based on a grain type market. So, one usually is far superior to the other. So if you have a good, strong crop rotation where part of your farm or part of your grower's farm is in one and not the other, then what you have is it doesn't matter what the farm market system does. You're consistently having something on those acres that are actually going to help you. And it also spreads your labor. This is consistent. We don't plant any of our crop rotations at the same time. Most of the time we plant them in succession. So, we get corn in April and we get soybeans in kind of early May. Cotton goes in late May. You can get double crop soybeans. Wheat harvest comes out in May. So you can see that it's a more consistent worth of labor where you can work with fewer heads of labor and have them more consistent throughout the year instead of having a high demand for labor and machinery at certain critical points in the time. The other thing that a lot of people forget is underground. We always forget about the underground system when we talk about our crops, and our differences in rooting profiles is ultimately what brings a lot of the benefits to the system. Something that has a taproot like soybean, grain sorghum, cotton, canola can add a lot of benefits by going down deep, getting nutrients, getting water stores from deep soil layers, as opposed to having wheat that's constantly, wheat or corn that's constantly in the top 24 inches, and that's where the primary bed of their roots are. So having something to be able to go get nutrients, redeposit them on the soil surface for the successive crop next year, that'll be a fibrous root system that'll have a lot of their nutrients primarily on that soil surface, and a lot of their roots are right there, kind of work out well together. So the question becomes, like, what crops do we want to do? So we'll forego wheat, because wheat is the predominant crop we have in our system. So what things could we rotate wheat with? Well, we have what I call, or will call here in this presentation, the old reliable systems. These are things that we know work in the state of Oklahoma. And so I have to highlight the point that adding crop diversity does not mean you have to go out and get a new crop, a new specialty crop or something that nobody's ever grown before. It's just maybe putting something into your system that actually is different than what you've been doing. Grain sorghum is probably one of our most reliant systems. If we want to talk about crops that are able to stand Oklahoma weather and Oklahoma conditions, farming conditions the most, we probably highlight two, and that's wheat and grain sorghum. Because when you look at crop failure, it's very minimal. I think if you go back and look at the data from RMA, out of 75 years that they've been collecting data on wheat, we've had a complete crop failure in a single year as a statewide, a single time, once. Even throughout those drought years in early 2010s, we still were able to pull off a semi-decent grain sorghum crop. It's also one of the lowest cost options for typical return on investment. Seed is cheap. We need a little bit of fertilizer. In-season management is cheap. Risk is cheap. Labor is cheap. So we have a low cost option with typically we'll be able to harvest a crop that can get you a pretty good return on investment. The increased opportunities that we have for grazing sorghum stocks are becoming more evident. We're starting to see very good opportunities. A lot of the risks that we thought originally we had in the system of prussic acid and nitrate toxicity, we're not seeing those come through if you manage that sorghum crop effectively and efficiently. And we're able to let our cattle go out on those stalks and be able to take advantage of some of that added nutrients and forage during the summer or during the winter months. The downfalls of the system is it's still a grass, and we're in a grass-based system. So some of the benefits of crop rotation, being able to target some of your grassy weeds and use herbicides effectively, are limited. You still can have quite a few pests that transition from wheat into grain sorghum pretty effectively. One of these that you can highlight is something we had an issue with this year was chinch bugs. We get chinch bugs all the time on wheat. They effectively can go to grain sorghum without seed treatment. So if you have something like soybeans that are not as affected by chinch bugs, that can be an issue you don't have to overcome. But if you go into sorghum because it's a grass going into a grass, that's something you will have to overcome. And once again, if you've worked with any growers growing sorghum, one of the biggest complaints is there's limited herbicide options specifically for grassy weeds. We're a very Johnson grass state. We have a ton of Johnson grass compared to most states in the United States. And so one of the biggest grasses are one of the hardest things to control in sorghum. But the only thing about this is you just have to be a little more proactive. You have to be more proactive in going out, getting those herbicides, managing them effectively, and be able to go forward in your season. So when we talk about another old reliable, and this one is highlighted as a soybean, but if you look at the general basis of this, soybean and corn are effectively the same. So these effectively can be talking about the same unit. The profit potential of both corn and soybean are extremely high. We have some growers this year that are telling stories of over $400 per acre net return on their soybeans. It's unbelievable how good our yields are coming off this year. And so it's got great potential. It's also a great rotation with all of our small grains and our cereals. It fits well into a summer crop rotation, very flexible within our system because we can do that double crop system. Actually, one of the best ways that we can integrate soybeans into our production system is to grow it right after wheat, as long as there's moisture. The only issue with this, as far as soybean and corn, is risk is high. A stretch of 90 days of over 100 degrees with very little rain and all that kind of will add up against soybean. We just won't be able to overcome that too often. And so it is a potential high risk, high reward crop. But realistically, there are ways to overcome it. You just that management has to be very, very on spot and on prime to be able to do soybeans effectively, especially when you get west of I-35. The last one of our old reliables is one that probably many people saw in places that they haven't seen in at least a decade, if not closer to 2, 3, or 4 decades, and that's cotton. There's an extreme increase in interest in the crop, and especially with our new 2,4-D dicamba options on the cotton crop, the interest is growing substantially. There's very decent yield potential. We can have a lot of guys that are getting multiple bale cotton this year, but a pretty modest bale and a half cotton with current prices can get you pretty good return on your investment with a lot of increasing infrastructure. We're having a lot of mills or a lot of gins go in places that they're seeing high priority for the future as far as the cotton crop. The downfall of having a lot of weed control options is the fact that there's a reason why there's a lot of weed control options is there's a lot of weeds that you have to deal with in cotton. And as you see the picture here, dealing with things like mare's tail and pigweed in cotton is a mainstay. You're going to happen. And it's something you have to do, and it's one that cotton, until it laps rows and covers up and shades up that bare ground, it does not compete well with our weeds. So it's something that has to be done. The other thing is in the drought, even in our cotton areas that are down in the water district, that a lot of guys were pumping a lot of water to it, we failed to cut a crop for about 4 years. We didn't get a single bale of cotton out of the state of Oklahoma. So that is an issue. It's not highly resilient. It's not as resilient as something like grain sorghum, but it's not as high risk, high reward as something like soybeans or corn. So it's kind of middle of the road. The biggest thing to do, or the biggest downfall, is small acre farmers. You either have to buy in or not with cotton. You're talking about the infrastructure is needed. There's a lot of specialty equipment. You're talking about high clearance sprayers. Harvesting equipment is different. So if you have to go everything custom, it can be very cost ineffective. The other thing is that all cotton producers have to enroll in the boll weevil eradication project. So a grower can't just go, I'm going to try 50 acres of cotton and see how I like it. That's just not a very cost-effective or fruitful measure. It's one of those you have to really buy into it and do a couple hundred acres to make it worth your while. But it is an option, and it's one that, especially as educators, I expect you guys to see a lot more in the future. I expect we saw about a 55% increase in acres this year. I expect about another 50% increase in acres for the next year. So when we look at some of our new faces, many of you might have familiarity with some of these, but some of you might not. One of the new players or new kids on the block is sesame. If you've ever talked to growers that have sesame, they either absolutely love the crop or they hate the crop. And one of the reasons why they love the crop is the market is right now is outstanding. The Chinese demand for sesame is more than we can possibly produce in 1 year. And so the demand is going to be high. We just have to kind of get into the market in the right time. There's great yield potential. We see break-even points at about 500 pounds of seed per acre, and most growers can adequately grow anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 pounds, given the right soil, the right conditions to happen, and all that. But 500 pounds as a break-even point for our sesame crop is actually one that is more easily obtained than not. However, when you look at the disadvantages, the herbicide outlook is very grim. There's pretty much nothing as far as broadleaf control. And since this is grown in more of our western portions, that we're having more of an issue with pigweed, mare's tail, some of our cockleburs, tie vines, et cetera. Kochia is starting to get into a big. There's really no in-season control for any of those really bad weeds when we get into sesame production. It can very effectively control grasses, but that's about it. And one of the big things is we currently have a stopgap as far as knowledge on how to manage the crop in Oklahoma. We don't effectively know all the intricacies like we do something like sorghum or wheat or cotton. We don't know all the little ins and outs of this production system, so it's something that can actually be quite challenging for a lot of growers. So that is a downfall. The other thing is even though the market is really good, you're working with basically one company, and so that's something you do have to overcome as well. One that we're seeing a lot of interest in is our summer edible beans, and summer and winter. We'll just go ahead and throw everything in. Our summer, winter edible beans and peas. It's a growing market. A lot of these markets are growing through farm to table, and this movement that we thought might be just a flash in the pan doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. And it's not only the fresh market. We have a very good outlet as far as Del Monte over in Fayetteville, Arkansas. So it's a place that we can get drop off to that is not in the fresh market, that can be adequately grown and utilized by our producers. And we have pretty good outlets for it. Oklahoma City and Tulsa are becoming more urbanized, and that farm to market movement is growing in all of those. And we are about as close as to Dallas-Fort Worth area, a lot of our growers, as the coastal bend down in Corpus Christi, Houston area of Texas. So as far as freight, getting this stuff down to a larger market in Dallas-Fort Worth area is about as cost effective as the adequate places they can produce these in Texas. So it is one that is growing. The other benefit is that it's something that's a broadleaf that's a lot more tolerant to some of our stress conditions. Lynn showed a really good picture, and it's a really telltale sign is that it essentially, I tell growers that might become interested in it, especially when you talk about like cowpeas or mung beans, it's soybeans that are tougher. And realistically, that's kind of what we're looking at. The one downfall that we have is, once again, we have stopgap. We don't know effectively, my apologies, we don't effectively know how to manage them. There is also contract and selling issues. We have had growers have some complaints about contracting and selling those with the fresh market as well as the other canning operations. So it's something that you have to get over. It is, especially going into the fresh market, quality is judged pretty strictly, and it needs to be very, very good quality product to go into that fresh market. It's not like soybeans that'll go mostly as feed. This is going mostly for human consumption. So getting good quality product is a lot more critical than it is in something like we have like in soybean. So when we talk about crop rotation, remember this is just the beginning. This is just kind of scratching the surface, and there are other aspects of crop rotation that we can really talk about in great detail, and know that management changes everything. And this kind of transitions into the next section we'll talk about is a little bit into tillage and see kind of how these things interconnect. I always tell growers that there are a lot of choices with tillage, and there's no right and wrong answer. People that think that tilling is a bad option, or no-till, it just doesn't work in Oklahoma. It's very narrow mindset, because both of them have a place and they both can work. But you just have to know how to work with the advantages and disadvantages of both systems. And sometimes one will fit and the other one won't, or sometimes both will fit into the same system. And that's a kind of grower's dream, is that they can choose kind of what fits into their farm management plan. But what helps you decide what tillage system you're going to go into is kind of what's your residue stability. Are you wanting to have that residue out there for a long amount of time? Do you have really, really stable residue that can help protect and ensure good production systems? What is your erosion potential of your piece of property? Do you have compaction issues? What about pest management? Do you have something, are you going wheat on wheat on wheat that could have some very detrimental pest management issues? And then what's your internal drainage situation? Are you a very flooded system? Are you feeling like you're not getting good drainage because you're tilling? These are all things that kind of go into that decision mechanism. So if we look at tillage just in general, once again, we're not going to go to advantages, disadvantages. We'll just talk about advantages, because most of the time the advantages of one is the disadvantage of the other. And so the question becomes, why do we till? Realistically, it's to prepare the seed bed and it's needed for some crops. When we talk about things like canola, Can we grow canola no-till? Absolutely. Is it more, or is it easier to grow it conventional? Absolutely. So it's one of those things that, once again, those both fit, but one fits just a little bit better. But getting that nice smooth soil surface to get that crop planted into a nice clean system is one that is a really good advantage for our conventional tilled system. The other things is it helps us remove problem areas of the field, and it's one thing that we don't see as often in Oklahoma, but when we do, it actually can get really detrimental, especially when it's like, I need to get my weed out. I just have to get my weed out, but it's raining all of May and all of 1st of June. And this year specifically, we saw a lot of ruts in the field that growers had to go out of longer till no-till to actually get into a tillage system to where they can actually take care of some of those ruts and those problem areas of the field. The other big thing is to incorporate residue. If you do have something like Goss's wilt is a disease in corn, but it also something like gray leaf spot or any of those spore-bearing diseases, sometimes you just have to incorporate that residue to kind of maintain that system disease-free or insect-free for the coming years. But also, if we need to incorporate chemistries, fertilizers, herbicides, insecticides, any of those options, varying degree of tillage is kind of the best way to do it. In Oklahoma, it's not advantageous to kind of wait for a rain. So the best thing to do is kind of utilize that tillage effectively and use it when you really need to. And also pest management. Lynn talked a lot about weed management. A phrase that we like to use is that nothing becomes resistant to steel. And for the most part, without the exception of Johnson grass, bindweed, and Bermuda grass, I mean, for the most part, that's true. I mean, it is one of the most effective way that we can overcome some of our weed management issues. The big thing is it's costly. There is wear and tear on the machinery. Diesel is cheap, but when commodity prices are down, diesel that is really cheap becomes not as cheap. But there's also wear and tear on machinery. There's a labor cost associated with it. There's travel time over your field. And that's one thing growers oftentimes don't take into account is how much is their time worth. And that's something that's very difficult to kind of formulate into a dollars and cents kind of mindset, but it's one that we need to be doing. So when we go to the opposite side is our no-till systems. So what are some of our advantages? Erosion control needs to be the number one priority. We talk about erosion control, and if you've ever driven around north central Oklahoma, especially if that's one of your counties up there, sometimes in the fall and the spring when the wind blows, we're donating about a ton of soil to Kansas. It just happens. In Oklahoma, the wind erosion potential is very high, and so tilling it and making it that ground into very fine powder really is antagonistic about where most people's farm goals are. So kind of introducing that no-till system is better. It's also fewer trips across the field, less diesel, less need for labor. All those things can really add up. Moisture retention is another big thing. And is soil health. I'll kind of group those two together. I won't kind of go into soil health in too much detail. I think most people have heard enough about soil health in the last couple of years. But saving moisture and retaining moisture into our production systems is invaluable. What a couple inches of soil can do in a summer crop going into the heat of the summer, as opposed to tilling it and not having those couple of inches of moisture can be very cost beneficial. It also can make our systems have a lot more resilience. The more organic matter you get in, the more moisture you retain, everything adds up to where when we have those bad years, sometimes in no-till, they're just not as bad. And so it's something that really can help us out in our production system if we integrate these no-till type systems. The one disadvantage I will talk about, it's the same thing I talked about in conventional till, is it's costly. Oftentimes there are additions you have to make on planters to make no-till more effective. You have to invest more into sprayers. You have to invest more in herbicides and chemistries. And the biggest thing is that growers have to understand is you have to both plant earlier and you have to plant later. In our summer crops, you have to plant these later because it takes longer for that soil to cool or to warm up in the spring because of that residue, kind of like what Lynn talked about on those mulches. Same thing in our no-till system is that it's got higher moisture, it doesn't get that direct radiation from the sunlight, so it takes a lot longer to warm up. But it's also one of the first ones that really can cool down because it just doesn't go with those temperature fluctuations in the fall. once it starts to cool down on average, we don't get really warm soil temperatures again. It kind of starts to cool down, and it just keeps on that general trend of continuing to cool down throughout the year. So it's one thing we have to look at it, and our conventional and our no-till systems are kind of on two opposite ends of the spectrum. So the question becomes: is there an in-between, and something that incorporates beneficial aspects of both? And the answer to that is strip till. And we can't do strip till for everything. This is more of our summer row crops that we can go on wider inch spacing. But what you do is you have a narrow strip to where you can do seed bed preparation, get those really good seed to soil contact, really nice seed bed preparation, minimizing in-row weeds. But it allows you to have those strips of residue in between to where you can actually get good moisture retention, good shading out of weeds in those rows, and start to build your organic matter up by quite a bit. So kind of takes the advantages of both and the advantages of both while minimizing some of the disadvantages. So the question becomes, is more importantly, does it impact yield? Oh, my graph is gone. Realistically, we have a graph here that in our canola production system, what we've seen is that compared to a conventional tilled system, our strip tilled system yielded about the same, and actually out-yielded the no-till systems by about 30%. So we can have that no-till and all the benefits with no-till without actually being full no-till, and we can get those better yields associated with it. So when we talk about is bringing it all together, this is probably a fraction of what needs to be fully discussed on these topics, but it's kind of what we had in the time that we had available to us. When we start integrating new crops into the system, it doesn't necessarily have to be new crops to Oklahoma. We can look at the crops that have been proven in Oklahoma that we know we have good management opportunities for, like our sorghum and our cotton, our corn, soybean. But what we're doing is we're just adding diversity to the system, getting those agronomic benefits of good weed control, good IPM management, organic matter, as well as getting those farm benefits of spreading risk and spreading labor out to kind of really help everything come all together. I do get asked a lot of times about crop rotation and cover crops. Do cover crops provide the benefit that crop rotation does? Well, sure. I mean, if it's a deep-rooted cover crop and you have a wheat system, that does provide the benefits. But kind of like how Lynn touched on earlier, that's essentially a fallow field. I mean, you get very little economic benefit unless you do graze that system, but you get smaller economic benefit than you would if you were pulling the grain off. The problem, I think, comes into pest management, and there was a publication that came out of the University of Nebraska just about 3 weeks ago that proved that under cover crop systems, we actually had increased soil seed bank of some of our weeds, particularly pigweed, water hemp, and mare's tail. And so those are our big baddies when we talk about a lot of our production system, because if it doesn't completely stop it, if you've ever worked with pigweed, you've ever worked with mare's tail, no amount of shading is going to stop those things from growing. So they're always going to grow, and you're not going to spray your cover crops until the end of the year. So it becomes like a catch-22 on doing those cover crops, because you don't typically manage them, you don't get that economic benefit, and if you're only working on weed control, sometimes that can be antagonistic of what your actual end goal is. When we talk about crop rotation and no-till production system, management does increase greatly. You have to be more on top of your management systems, your decision making, your variety selection, because these decisions just become more critical, and you become heavily reliant on either pesticides, mainly when you're talking about herbicide management, because if you don't have steel, you're going to rely on chemistries almost exclusively, or more our high-intensive management systems like Lynn talked about, is mulching, plastic wrapping, et cetera, in our smaller, more specialty crops. And really, a lot of this just depends on the scale. This can be very cost-effective in both large scale and small scale. The little intricacies of the system just end up being a little bit different. So with that, kind of a little over, not too bad. Not bad for an extension guy, being just 4 minutes over. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you guys have. If not, you guys can write down any of my contact information, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you had in the future.
Thank you, Josh. If you do have questions, you can enter them into the chat box in the lower right-hand corner for him, and he can answer them. And as always, we appreciate your feedback on these webinars, and so please help us by filling out a short webinar, and I'm going to paste a link into the chat box if you would fill that out. Tell us how we're doing and everything. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. I want to remind you that our next webinar will be on November 14th and will include a panel of speakers discussing what's realistic on 50 acres of crops. Until then, goodbye. To remind you that our next webinar will be on November 14th and will include a panel of speakers discussing what's realistic on 50 acres of crops. Until then, goodbye.